Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs looks at profit margins in the feedlot. Loren Giesler describes how producers can scout for soybean diseases. Julie Peterson talks about western bean cutworm numbers this season, and Aaron Hurd explains how cover crops and no-till might benefit a cropping system. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. American exports of beef and veal are on track for their second best year on record with data back to 1989. Through the first half of 2017, shipments were up 15% from the same time frame in 2016 and on pace to finish behind only 2011's top. Japan has been the largest buyer this year, taking 30% of U.S. exports. South Korea and Mexico follow in second and third, with Canada and Hong Kong rounding out the top five. Meanwhile, U.S. beef imports over the first 6 months of 2017 were 7% lower than the previous year, thanks in part to larger American production and shorter supplies in Australia and New Zealand. Domestically, the price for all fresh retail beef ticked up about 4 cents from June to July, reaching its highest level in 13 months. Prices for producers, however, are going in the opposite direction. The August live cattle contract last week sunk to its lowest close since April, off more than $17 from its high in early June. We talked with Mike Wednesday morning and began by asking about those recent market movements.
Pretty much one direction, straight down. We've pretty much dropped about $9-10 in 8 or 9 days.
Is this what you would expect, though, seasonally?
No, you know, we talked about this earlier. I thought this would probably happen, but I thought it would be a little more gradual, not just straight off a cliff. But that's what happens nowadays when you've got the fund money. When the money flow goes in one direction, the market goes that way really hard, irregardless of whether we really needed to. And you can kind of tell we didn't, because we're still selling cash cattle over the board. And you're never doing that this time of year. This time of year, it's usually boards premium to cash.
That's what I was going to ask. Do you think they're seeing signals of supply later on that are causing them to exit?
You know, when the fund managers get going, we always push this market one way too far, whether it was too high this spring or too low now. I think the cash is obviously more representative of what's going on. I don't think there's quite as many cattle out there. And it's because we have pulled ahead almost 1 million head of cattle through the summer and slaughtered them early. Now, I think we're going to catch up on ourselves, and I think that's maybe what the market is seeing. We're going to have some struggles with supply in September, October.
So to this point, what have margins been like this summer?
Margins have been good. They've been in the black. I mean, you're not pulling it in with both hands, but you're still in the black, and that's always a good thing. As we go forward here now, we're trading some cash this week around 110. I can't believe there's very many break-evens below that, and I know after that the break-evens are considerably higher, like 15s, 20s, some of that kind of stuff, and so it's going to start hurting a little bit.
Those were bought when, just to try and set the scene?
Oh, March, April, May.
when it was starting to ride
Yeah,
high.
well, yeah, when the cattle market was red hot, you bet. People were selling a lot of cattle in the spring and replacing them.
Feed prices still helping?
Feed prices are helping. We haven't ran this thing out of bounds. Kind of looked like maybe we were going to for a minute, and the USDA said, nope, crop's still there. Don't believe them. I think we've probably seen our biggest crop as far as the USDA is concerned, and I think we get smaller from here, but I don't think corn goes to $5 or anything where it's going to hurt you.
Those placements numbers that we saw in the last couple cattle on feed reports were high and even higher than what the trade was expecting. When we get next week's cattle on feed report, do you expect we'll see the same thing?
I don't expect it simply because the feeder fat swap is so bad. In other words, you can't sell your cattle and buy cattle that make any money, so we're just feeding the ones we have. That's going to be detrimental to the market though as we move forward. We make our cattle, we already know we're going to have a big supply coming. Then if we add pounds, now we add tonnage, now we get ourselves in a little bit of trouble, I'm afraid.
Interesting from your perspective where they're coming from, those higher placements.
It is, because I'm not doing it, and everybody I talk to is not doing it. I don't know. I think it's the bigger players. They want, they've got those big feed yards they got to keep full, so they're keeping them full.
Describe how strong beef exports have been.
Exports have been excellent. We're up 15% over last year. A lot of that's due to the value of the dollar. It's in our favor. It's lower. And plus the fact beef just isn't so incredibly high as it was last year, so it's a great value. And we're not only seeing good export demand, we're seeing good demand, period. I think the consumer feels a little bit better. The prices in the retail store are much better than they were last year. And so people are more comfortable buying it, and that's really helped this thing quite a bit.
Comfortable with the level of meat prices?
That's a really good question. We did it to ourselves again. We got it too high in the spring, so we've had to have a pretty big adjustment, but I think we're pretty good right here. Hopefully we don't have to work beef a lot lower. Hopefully demand will stay in there. I think it will. Pretty good opportunity for retailers, so I think this thing's going to be okay. It's just going to be if we put too much tonnage on this market.
We're talking after a big rain event across Nebraska, but overall in August, what has performance been like?
Performance has been tremendous. This is one of the best cattle feeding August I can remember, because it's just been amazing. Now July, that was another story. We started sprinklers the 6th of July and ran them every day till the 24th of July. That was awful. But amazingly enough, the cattle don't seem to be hurt from that. They've come back. The weather's been fantastic, and they're really putting on the pounds.
All right, to close out with, tell me how you think supply impacts prices over the next few months here.
I think we're going to struggle for the next 30 or 45 days, which is there's all kinds of things that come from that. You're going to have a tough time in the ranching sector selling your calves for very much money, because I think prices are going to be depressed. On the other hand, it's going to give feeders an opportunity for a little better swap. Once you get that swap straightened out, you might see these cattle go to market a little bit better and not be so big, and that'll help us out. But I think we're going to struggle here for 30 or 45 days.
One follow-up question. Has the rancher paid as much as you thought he would?
Oh, I think he has, because on top of poor prices, you've had a little bit of a drought in some of those areas, especially up in the Dakotas. It's been really hard on them. So I think the ranchers gotten the dirty end of the stick this year.
Next week, North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson will join us to look at corn, soybean, and wheat markets. Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service says the condition of the state's soybeans improved over the last week. The latest NASS report lists 61% of the state's beans in good to excellent categories, a jump of 3 points from a week ago. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler says growers can be scouting for several diseases in fields across the state. We talked with Loren at last week's Soybean Management Field Day event in North Platte.
Well, this time of year is a great time to scout for some of these problems that then when you're making seed selections in the future in those fields, you can use some resistant varieties. So, this time of year we start seeing our sudden death syndrome show up. We're seeing white mold show up. Phytophthora earlier in the season through now can be there, and even brown stem rot. So quite a bit of diversity out there on what they could be seeing, and really a good time to scout for it.
Give me the background on sudden death syndrome and where you might find it.
So SDS, we've been seeing a little bit more of it throughout the last several years, and particularly the eastern third of the state, I would say really becoming more common. It's not in every field. And the other thing is all of these we're talking about are diseases that are managed really field by field, and very specific. But you'll be seeing those leaves with interveinal chlorosis right now, areas of the field dying fairly quickly, defoliating but leaving leaf stems attached. Okay, and there's lots of great pictures on our websites to look at to help identify that one as well.
The management for white mold, how easy can it be?
White mold is something that, right now people see it and they tend to want to go out and try to make a fungicide application and control it. And all the research has shown that's really not a profitable move in general. So really you want to make sure that you have that potential for the disease. Come in during the flowering time, because that disease infects the flowers and that's where it all starts. If there's no flowers, your crop's really not susceptible if you haven't had the disease yet. So you really want to watch that. And then in the future years, I'd really recommend going into looking at some applications during that bloom time of year. And unfortunately for a lot of our growers, this is really becoming pretty common, with our weather patterns that we've been seeing.
So is it becoming more common than just those areas, the low-lying areas that don't get a lot of wind, or areas that you've drilled, or
Yeah, I think it's more geographically. I mean, I think it's, more particularly the northern part of the state, you tend to see a lot more of it. But, that northeast section, and in any of those soybeans up in the northern section going towards central Nebraska, really becoming more common. Not everywhere, but it is there. The other thing with that to consider as you go into the future is, if you're doing any row spacing that you have the ability to go to wider rows and it fits, that's a good move for that.
Brown stem rot?
Brown stem rot, we haven't seen a lot of brown stem rot in the state, but we see it every year and it looks a lot like SDS. So it's always important to make sure you're identifying that one correctly, and the leaf symptoms can look almost identical. So really, really good to make sure you're pulling plants, splitting stems, and again, seeing if you see dark discoloration in the stem, you'd be dealing with brown stem rot.
Management issues?
Management on that one, really going to be a variety selection. Tends to be a problem more with some of our off pH conditions, higher pHs. But it really something that you're going to be doing variety selection for.
And phytophthora to finish off.
The last one, phytophthora, really one that it's a water mold, likes those flooded conditions. This time of year, looking at pivot tracks, great place to scout for it. Right there, on those wheel tracks where there's some standing water, sometimes you can see some dead plants. The key on that one is to keep in mind that if you see that pretty much anywhere in the field and you see scattered plants, you're probably having some yield loss in addition to those dead plants. So make sure you're selecting variety resistance, that you've got good tolerance, a field tolerance score as well as resistance, and then using good seed treatments.
You can find more pictures and information about scouting for sudden death syndrome in Loren's recent article on the CropWatch website. As we told you in October, some corn growers using the Cry1F trait to help manage western bean cutworm were seeing disappointing results. A group of entomologists from several universities had written an open letter then detailing the struggles in controlling the insect using that protein. While in North Platte last week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Julie Peterson about controlling the pest. As she said when we talked in October, Nebraska farmers had been seeing poor performance from Cry1F for several years. We started by asking about western bean cutworm moth numbers in her area this season.
So again, we had a pretty high flight of western bean cutworm, fairly similar to what we've seen the last couple of years. We definitely saw central part of the state, Kearney, Grand Island, had a very early flight and a very heavy flight as well. A little bit further west, around the North Platte, Brule, and Grant area, we are still having the very tail end of our western bean cutworm moth flight. Numbers are definitely starting to peter out though.
The emergence earlier and maybe heavier, is that alarming at all?
It definitely is, in terms of we're seeing eggs being laid in cornfields maybe over a bit of a longer period of time, especially this year with there being some delayed plantings, some slower development with the weather we had right after planting. We have more of a spread in terms of the development of the corn plants themselves. So that has been a challenge this year to manage with having different crop stages happening at the time of when egg laying is also happening.
Just as an overview, I should ask what kind of damage they can do to a corn plant.
Well, they are going to be causing their yield loss by feeding on developing ears of the corn. So the eggs are laid on the upper surfaces of upper leaves. The larvae really prefer to feed on fresh tassel when they first hatch. And that has been something for this year. When eggs are laid on corn that's still a couple weeks away from tassel and that tassel tissue is not available, those young larvae really don't survive as well. So that's really their preference, is tassel tissue first, and then they start to move down into the silks and into the developing ears. That's really what we're seeing right now in the field, is that movement down into the silks and the developing ears right now.
Too late for any kind of treatment?
Once they get inside the ear, it is definitely too late. They're going to be protected inside of the husk and inside of the silk, and so insecticides aren't going to be able to reach them there.
We talked last October, after the season, I think, about the resistance that we've been seeing in western bean cutworm and the Cry1F protein specifically. Can you explain more on what we know about that?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of studies the last couple years to try to get a better understanding of what the current susceptibility is to Cry1F proteins in particular. These are the proteins that are in the Herculex and SmartStax traits. We are seeing quite a bit of variation within our state that not all populations are responding in the same way to Cry1F. So in some situations, Cry1F is really not providing much protection anymore, but in other parts of the state, we do see that Cry1F can help to suppress western bean cutworm.
What does that mean? The resistance just hasn't reached that area yet?
I think it means that we are seeing different selection pressures across the state, and we're also seeing a mixing of the genetics of the moths. You know, they do emerge, and they can fly for pretty long distances before they will mate and lay eggs. So we are still seeing mixing together of these populations.
Would you recommend anything differently for growers next season?
I would really think about your BT trait selection and really being aware of what you're planting and whether it's going to provide you with any protection against western bean cutworm. So not all of the BT traits that provide protection against things like European corn borer, not all of them also work for western bean cutworm. So you can refer to the handy BT trait table as a really good resource, and you can always contact myself or one of our other extension entomologists just so that you have a better awareness of maybe what you're planting and how it might protect you against western bean cutworm and other crop pests.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to the handy BT trait table Julie mentioned. The August, Nebraska farmer says on June 16, 2014, 2 deadly EF4 tornadoes struck near Pilger, Nebraska. One twister ripped through the community, charging on a course towards Josh Alexander's family farm and feedlot. This month's issue highlights how Alexander, as well as the town of Pilger, has rebuilt after the damage. You can read more about that in the August, Nebraska Farmer. A Nebraska Extension crop diagnostic clinic held at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center during July centered on soil health and crop production. One focus area for that topic was the use of cover crops in no-till systems. Aaron Hurd works with the Natural Resources Conservation Service as this state's soil health specialist and has worked with producers using cover crops since 2010. He talked with us at the event about how the combination of cover crops and no-till could benefit the soil.
I've worked with cover crops since 2010 with many producers, growing them and learning with them, and learned about the intricacies of cover crops and the management issues that come with them.
So when we talk about no-till and cover crops, tell me why no-till maybe always isn't the only thing that you can do for your soil.
So a lot of our soil has residual structure problems related to tillage in the past. And so that tillage history in our fields causes us trouble when we convert to no-till. There's tillage layers in the soil, which are restrictive layers. And restrictive layers prevent water movement, nutrient cycling, and root growth. And so in a no-till, long-term no-till field, we're totally dependent upon frost freeze events, wetting and drying, and a limited amount of root activity in the soil to solve that structure problem and allow water movement and air movement. And with cover crops, we can certainly address that.
Can you describe more what might happen to a root in a situation like that?
Absolutely. Our cash crop roots have a very low rooting pressure tolerance. And when they hit a restrictive layer, they'll turn and grow horizontally in the soil and thereby not be able to access further soil moisture in the soil further down and nutrients that are placed further down. And so they're growing horizontally, wasting their energy, wasting time, and costing yield.
So what's the answer to that?
Cover crops really have a lot higher rooting pressure tolerance, and so they can drive holes through those restrictive layers, thereby paving the road for cash crop roots to follow the next year.
Does it matter what kind of cover crop you're using?
Different cover crops have different rooting pressure tolerances, and so there are certainly brassicas in the mix would help with that. Deep taprooted plants like canola and sunflowers are certainly something that I would advise for that.
So earlier this year we talked with Craig Derrickson about ephemeral gullies and
some of the washing that happened and what producers would need to do and how they'd need to manage it. And one of the options was cover crops. Why are cover crops maybe a good option in those situations?
Well, cover crops, after we've fixed the problem, the issue on the soil surface with a little bit of a tillage event to fix the ephemeral gully, it's not settled. The soil's there loose. It's not going to hold, and so the very next rain event, it will potentially wash right back to the bottom of that tillage event. And so a cover crop is a very valuable tool in that situation to heal the soil in, to really put roots in the soil and build structure immediately, and as well as armor the soil surface. So the next time there's surface water flowing over it, it will protect that soil surface.
What's the hesitation to doing that? Just an easier way is just to till it back in?
To till it back in and let the corn residue come back over it maybe, but that soil is still unconsolidated and loose, and so it's a real risk.
What are some of the other areas that NRCS might be able to help farmers with conservation practices?
Definitely other conservation practices for those ephemeral gullies are grass waterways or terraces, sediment basins, things like that. If it's too steep, too much volume going through that for a cover crop to hold.
Areas outside of the ephemeral gullies where you think producers might be able to take advantage of some of the NRCS activities?
Absolutely. So in an agronomic system like this, cover crops really address many of our issues that we see in a crop field. We don't really have an erosion problem. We have a water infiltration problem. So I think that's our number one issue. And then getting biological diversity in the system is critical to cycling nutrients and helping those crops yield better.
Why do you think there's a water infiltration problem?
Back to the restrictive layer. Most of our fields have that historic tillage layer that's never been addressed. And so we'll see a 25-year no-till field or a long-term no-till field that still has those restrictive layers in it, and it only has a 1/2 inch per hour infiltration rate. With cover crops for 5 years, we can change that infiltrate substantially. And I've seen fields with 9 and 14-inch infiltration rates per hour that can receive a heavy rain event and soak all that water into the soil profile.
How does a farmer find that? Do they need to dig up the soil and find those roots that are shooting sideways?
Absolutely. I challenge farmers to really take a shovel to their field, to investigate their soil with a small pit and see if the soil horizontally fractures. That's an unnatural fracture, especially if it's on a paper's edge, and that identifies where the problem is, and then the cover crop roots can really address that. The work of cover crops for Nebraska is at 8 inches in the soil.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. And of course, during this last week, the big news was the significant rain event that hit much of the central sandhills, southern sandhills, over into east central Nebraska. We've had unofficial reports of up to 12 inches of rainfall over this event, but officially the NE Rain Network shows that we had several locations where we were in the 6 to 7 inch range, particularly around the Broken Bow area, David City area. We still have had some flooding issues that have been ongoing from the runoff, but overall we should expect with this precipitation event a pretty significant reduction in next week's drought monitor depiction, particularly in those areas hit with 4+ inches of moisture. Unfortunately, as you got up along the Nebraska-South Dakota border, precipitation totals dropped off a little bit. So my expectations are that we may see some improvements there, but not significant improvements. Further southward, unfortunately, the system kind of broke apart as it headed into southeast Nebraska, and precipitation totals dropped off dramatically as the system petered out, only to reform that front farther to the south of us. So overall, we did see one of our better precipitation events in a long time across central Nebraska. We need to see more of these precipitation events. But as we go through this next 7 days, of course, the big news is with the eclipse on Monday, what is the forecast going to be? But before we get to that main forecast, what we will tell you according to the GFS model is that there is a possibility across eastern Nebraska, particularly eastern 1/3 of the state, for some of the precipitation activity to hold on a little bit during the morning hours, possibly impeding our visual experience with the eclipse. But as you go farther west, it looks like conditions may be a little bit better. So as we go to the upper air models, what we will see is we have a general northwest to southeast flow in the upper atmosphere, trough over the Great Lakes region, ridging to our south. So we got high pressure extending across the southern United States, low pressure to our northwest. Those will begin gradually trying to move our way, but we're not expecting any precipitation in the southern plains. Anything that shows up is going to be to the east of us. Then we see another trough trying to make its way across the northern plains. That's going to see a surface low start to induce itself in western Kansas, bringing up some Gulf moisture into the central plains, generating the possibility of thunderstorm activity across eastern Nebraska, particularly during the afternoon hours. And then as we get into Monday, that trough starts to move toward the Great Lakes, and we get kind of a zonal flow, but we do have this pesky little low that's going to move into the northeast. This is the one that we're worried about holding up the precipitation in eastern Nebraska. Most of this convection shown here is during the morning hours and will be lifted to the northeast. So hopefully this will clear out in time. And then on Tuesday, we start to see the ridge starting to build back in. Warmer temperatures start to move into our region as we have high pressure dominating much of the central United States. And of course, with that high pressure, most of the precipitation should beat our east. I think we're overplaying the precipitation shown for northeastern Nebraska. On Wednesday, that high pressure system starts to build in at the upper levels of the atmosphere into the central plains. High pressure to our east and to our southwest with a low pressure over the Intermountain region. Therefore, temperatures will increase and the monsoon flow will start to push up some moisture into western Nebraska, maybe an isolated thunderstorm possible. Then we see a little kink in the ridge as some energy tries to move around it, and a surface low generating itself once again down to our south that will start to lift moisture up into our region once again, and that will have the ability to possibly generate thunderstorm activity, particularly over the eastern half of the state, and that's likely to hold on as that wave starts to move to the east and peters out. Some of that residual moisture with that surface low will still be around, particularly across the eastern part of the state as that low is in eastern Kansas, and that moisture will generate what we believe will be a complex of thunderstorms developing over Iowa and eastern Nebraska. Now, as we go to the 8 to 14 day forecast, cooler conditions are projected once again to materialize over the eastern United States with warm air to our west with that ridge building in. And in terms of precipitation, most of the central plains south to Texas and eastward to the Atlantic Ocean will see above normal moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, soybean diseases, western bean cutworm, and cover crops in no-till systems. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our grain market analyst, and we'll show you how UNL researchers are studying plant phenotyping using a suspended camera. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.